Good morning. God is good all the time, and we're glad you're here. We have a number of empty seats today, as a number of our families I know are at other places to celebrate Mother's Day with their mothers, and we're happy that they can go there and be with their mothers. And we have some mothers that have come here to be with us, and we're glad to have you as well on this Mother's Day. And we appreciate all of our guests, and if you're looking for a church home, we'd certainly like to talk to you about the faith and fellowship that brings us together every Lord's Day, not only on Sunday mornings, but we meet on Sunday evenings as well. And at 6 o'clock this evening, we have what we call a minister's Bible class, and we're studying the book of Psalms tonight, and we'll be in Psalms chapter 8 if you want to do a little reading ahead of time this afternoon. We invite you back for that Bible study and devotional to follow. This special day that we call Mother's Day, we of course owe to a woman named Anna M. Jarvis. She gathered a memorial service on behalf of her own mother who had passed away back in May 10th, 1908. And when all the guests arrived, she would give each of them a white carnation. That was her mother's favorite flower. And it became sort of a tradition for many, many decades after that. Although as we were talking in our Bible class this morning, I don't see anybody wearing a carnation this morning or a flower. Maybe some, but that used to be the tradition when I was growing up, and for many of you, that mothers would wear a flower on their carnation or something to recognize you are your mother in that regard. But over the next few years, following Miss Jarvis's remembering of her mother, the idea of a day to honor mothers became very popular. It's gathered across the country. And finally, on May 9th, 1914, by act of Congress and then by President Woodrow Wilson, signed and proclaimed into law that the second Sunday in May would be declared as Mother's Day, and that's why we have it today. That was 104 years ago today. The woman who may personify the ideal mother in the Old Testament is the woman that I want us to focus on today as we think about mothers and as we study a particular mother. She's best known as the mother of Samuel, one of the earliest prophets and then also one of the judges of the Old Testament. The story is told in the first 2 chapters of the book of Samuel. And in 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 1 through 5. And I want to read those verses this morning. And there was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. And year after year this man went up from the town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. And whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all of her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. The annual visits that was their tradition to the house of God at Shiloh were especially painful to this woman named Hannah. As parents and children would come together to celebrate this time of life and the giver of life, Hannah would probably slip away from the festivities, and there she would pour her heart out to God and mourn the fact that she had no children. that she was not a mother. Hannah, however, believed with all of her heart that God was the creator of children. And why would God, the God, that only God, who could convert a woman into a mother, why she had been left childless? Hannah's life story certainly makes her one of the most extraordinary women of the Bible. And so this morning I want us to focus on Hannah and learn what lessons we can from her. Because her story is a story of despair. It's a story of prayer as well as a story of commitment. But as we first of all focus on the fact that Hannah was a mother of despair. It is said in the Scriptures that Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none in verse 2. These, we understand, were polygamous times. Though Elkanah had 2 wives, we read that Hannah, no doubt, was his favorite. But this added, ironically, to her despair. Look at verses 6 and 7. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. And whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. A tough time for Hannah, no doubt. You can only imagine the mental abuse, the cruelty, the sarcasm, the cutting remarks that she had to endure from her rival Peninnah, the jealousy that had prompted that, to provoke this woman to perceive another as her rival in this case. It was a tough household to live in, and especially during this time when they were celebrating life and the creator of life at Shiloh. Some of you probably know some of the grief that maybe she was going through. Hannah's husband eventually tried to comfort her in the best way he knew how. In fact, verse 8 tells us, Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? No doubt, Elkanah was trying to be sincere, and this was a sensitive effort on his part, but yet, no doubt, a very unsuccessful part. We read in verse 5 that Elkanah always gave Hannah a double portion of the traditional sacrifice because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. But ironically, Hannah's despair also became her blessing. While at the lowest point in her life here emotionally, it was also caused her to arise, maybe to the highest point spiritually. It was Hannah's despair that gave the world an example of trust and faith and hope in a God who never forgets. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 10, This is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, he says, in insults and hardships and persecution and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Hannah probably would challenge that expression in her day. She was going through a very weak time. She didn't know really and probably how strong she really was. I have too many times witnessed a mother's despair at a low points in their life. Maybe when a child through an accident or disease has died. I've never witnessed a greater pain in all of the earth and others than at the loss of a child or to be without a child. There are some like Hannah who know the pain of never having a child. I've seen it in our own family. My sister, I have a sister who was never able to have children, and I know it has caused her a great deal of pain. And some of you know what that's like as well. I can't imagine a mother's pain and despair as Hannah is experiencing. But at the same time, I know there are some here in this audience who certainly can. Some know very personally just exactly how she must have felt in some way. Someone said if it was going to be easy to raise children, it would have never started with something called labor. And you ladies, many of you know what that's all about. But not only was Hannah a mother of despair, she was also, we see, a mother of prayer. Hannah no doubt believed in the power of prayer. Look at verse 9 as we continue to read her story. And once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be upon his head. This was a prayer of faith. It was a prayer of commitment. It was a prayer of promise. Hannah is the fourth great woman that we read about in the Bible, that here in Bible history, who grieved because she could not conceive a child. Of the four that we read about, Hannah, no doubt, or at least from all appearance sake, gives us the impression she was the most prayerful. Others we remember like Sarah, the wife of Abraham. You recall when she was told she was going to have a child, she laughed at it. Rebekah, and her desire to have a child, seems to be almost indifferent from what we read. And Rachel, on the other hand, was oftentimes very irritated. In fact, at one time exclaimed, "Either give me a child or else I'm going to die." We can see the frustration in all of these ladies, and now especially in Hannah. Hannah's humility and prayer and submission to God is now revealed by just how she refers to herself as God's servant. Now, Eli is the priest at the temple. When Hannah comes in to pray, he observes what she's doing. He doesn't understand, but he reacts very interesting to the prayer. He's sitting on his chair, the Bible tells us, by the doorpost. And then verses 10 begins his reaction. Or excuse me, it's verse 12. And as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long are you going to keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine." "Not so, my Lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." The high priest, Eli, jumps to conclusions, which is sometimes characteristic of men when it's in our relationship with women. And Hannah is just, or Eli is just one of those. It makes the warning of Jesus in Matthew 7, 1 and 2, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged," much more real in some cases. We read Hannah's response here. "I'm not drunk. I'm not even drinking wine or beer. I'm praying. I'm pleading with God to help me in this case." And then notice that Eli's rebuke now turns to a retraction, actually. And Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." Hannah's prayer of faith was answered, and answered very miraculously. We read on down to verse 20. "And so in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. I'm one of those who believe that every conception and every birth of a child is certainly a miracle from God. Now, that doesn't mean that every conception is an answer to prayer. We know that's not true, I guess, because that's why in this country we murder over 1 million babies a year through organizations like Planned Parenthood and others. And I think our nation will answer for that one day. But here we find that the husband, I'll never forget a phone call I received a few years ago from a husband. His wife had just had an abortion, had just killed their child, and he was distraught. His wife was distraught. He refused to give me his name. He just called on the phone. He was a desperate person. He said his wife was going through emotional trauma because she was wondering if God would ever be able to forgive her. If you believe in the power of prayer as Hannah did, then I plead with you to pray that the women of our nation and our world will restore the decency and the purity and the morality back to motherhood. But not only was Hannah a mother of despair and a mother of prayer, Hannah was a mother of commitment. Her first commitment, of course, was to God. She made a vow, the Bible tells us, to God, give me a son, and I'll give him to you. I'll give him to you in service in whatever way is necessary. Now, think about it for just a moment. After Samuel was born, after the child had come and she had held it in her arms and fed it and cuddled it and loved it, do you think she ever had any doubts? You know, I don't know, God. I'm kind of renegotiating whether I really want to do this or not, whether I really want to give him back to you and in some way. I mean, after you all, I've never held a child of my own like this before, and now that I'm having second thoughts about this, you know, you would think that maybe she had those thoughts. I don't know that she did, and there's no Bible indication that she did. But you got to wonder about mothers in a case like this. What a sacrifice this was going to make. She's going to say, God, I'm sorry, this is just a greater sacrifice than I ever imagined it would be. It's too great. I can't do this any longer. But the Bible doesn't tell us that. In fact, it tells us the very opposite. But I wonder sometimes how many of us, when we're going through suffering or trials or sorrows, and we oftentimes make promises to God, don't we? God, if you'll just heal me from this, if you'll just restore my health, or restore this or that, or my friend, or my parents, or my wife or husband, if you do this, I promise, I promise, I promise. And then sometimes we forget what we promised after the crisis has passed. Hannah's commitment, however, was real. Verse 24. Chapter 1. And after he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And when they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. And she said to him, As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you, praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. Wow. Talk about commitment. There's the definition of the word. Not only a commitment to God, but we find she also made a commitment to her husband. How unhappy those circumstances must have been at home for Hannah for all those many years. the jealousy, the abuse that she endured from Peninnah, the other woman in the house, Elihu's the other woman, the wife. It would have been easy, you think, to just run away. And you wouldn't blame her if she did, would you? Just say, I'm getting out of here. I can't stand this no longer. Many today certainly would have justified her in doing that, but she didn't. And after Samuel's birth, who would have blamed her if she said, you know what? I think I'm going to move to Shiloh. I'm going to move over there so I can be close to Samuel. And I can kind of look after him. We have no record that she did that as well. She didn't leave Elkanah. She stayed with him. Why? Because she made a vow to Elkanah, just like she had made to God. And she took that vow seriously, to love and honor and obey her husband. It was just as real as the vow she had made to God. Unfortunately, like some today who take it more flippantly. But she also made a commitment to her son. Hannah never failed to express her commitment. Here's one way that we see it happening. We go to chapter 2 and verse 19, and here's the words we read. And each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Every year she brought a token of her love and her commitment to Samuel, and a reminder of what she had done and what God had done for her. You can be sure that Hannah sewed every stitch with love and with tears. Little did she know at the time that Hannah was giving to the world a priest, a prophet, a judge, a man of God that would stand in the very moment when an entire nation was going through the tremendous transition that would change the world in such significant proportions. But that's what Samuel was going to become, all because Hannah prayed and made a commitment. And I can't help but believe that Samuel's memory of his mother's love and commitment and all of that sustained him through all of those tough days ahead when he was dealing with Saul, for example, as well as David and the many, many others that Samuel had to deal with as a priest and a preacher and a prophet and a judge. Some dark hours. But it was in those darkest moments that you must believe that Samuel would remember a mother's love, a mother's commitment, first of all to God, and to her husband, and to her son. But God was not through with Hannah, because we look at verse 21 of chapter 2. And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. And meanwhile the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. 5 more children blessed Hannah's life. Now, someone has written a child's prayer on Mother's Day I'd like to share with you this morning. And if you can imagine somehow that maybe this was something close to what Samuel would have prayed concerning his mother. It goes like this. God in heaven, I thank Thee that this day on bended knee for the wonderful mother Thou hast given to me. Her heart is kind and gentle, flowing with love and care. Her touch is warm and loving. Her life a constant prayer. How she so often draws me into her arms to read God's holy word, the Bible, words that my heart should heed. How often, too, I hear her whisper my name in prayer. Never a childish problem, but she is always there. God in heaven, I ask thee now while I bow to pray, in thy great loving kindness, bless my mother today. And that's our prayer, that God would bless all mothers today and every day. The story is told of a man who stopped by a flower shop to order some flowers to be sent by FDD to his mother on Mother's Day, and she lived about 200 miles away, and so it wasn't practical for him to run over there, and so he was going to mail her some flowers. But as he stepped outside, there was a little girl sitting on the step. She was holding a single rose, and she was crying. It was pouring down rain outside, and the man stopped and said, "Little girl, what's going on? What's the matter?" She says, "Well, I've bought this rose for my mother, and I wanted to take it and give it to her, but it's so raining so hard, and she lives, she's a good ways away, and I'm not sure how I'm going to get there." And he said, "I'll take you, no problem." And so he takes the little girl and her rose, and he says, "Just give me directions." And she told him where to go and turn here and turn there, and she said, "Here it is." And he stopped and he looked out, and there was a cemetery. And he watched as the little girl walked out of the car and walked over to a freshly drawn grave and laid the rose on the grave. And she came back, and then he took her to her home where she was staying. After doing so, the man got in his car and drove right back to the flower shop, canceled his order of those FTD flowers, picked them up himself, and drove the 200 miles to give them to his mother. Thank you, mothers, for who you are and what you are, and God bless you. If we can help you to be a better mother today, then this invitation is for you as together we stand and sing for your encouragement.